Hi, everybody. A warm welcome to all of you who have logged in and are joining this conversation with three wonderful critics. They're here to talk to us about literature and music and art and life and the politics of the left. Peter Coviello had the idea for tonight's event, and I'm so happy to have reconnected with him as a result. Having loved his previous book, which is called Long Players, a love story in 18 songs, for which he did an event at Labyrinth, I forget what year, but not long ago. I'm equally happy for the occasion today to hear from his colleagues and friends who are joining him tonight. And just have a couple of quick housekeeping notes for you. If you would like to buy a copy of Peter's Vineland reread or Stadler's Guthrie biography, we're going to be talking about both of those. Just click on that long button at the bottom of the screen and you can enter either Coviello or Stadler at checkout, and that'll get you 10% off on the entire order. It doesn't matter which you enter, they both work. Or, of course, give us a call or send us an email. All of that information is at the top of the chat, and we'd love to hear from you. We're looking forward to your questions after the conversation. Just a quick pointer there. To ask a question, you will need to click the Ask a Question button also at the bottom of your screen instead of entering questions into the chat. So we'll be taking from that queue. And please just enter those questions as they come to you. That's actually helpful because we can then see if there are many in the queue, we can time things one way, and if there are fewer, we can time things another. So just by all means, enter those as you think of them. But now just a few biographical notes, and then our three guests will take it away. Peter Coviello is professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he specializes in American literature and queer theory. He's the author of 5 books, which include Intimacy in America, Dreams of Affiliation in Antebellum Literature, Tomorrow's Parties, Sex and the Untimely in 19th Century America, and the just mentioned Long Players. One of the occasions for our conversation today, though, is Vineland Reread. That's a study of Pynchon's not so celebrated, actually, novel. And it will send you back to the book if you've read it already, or back to it if, as in my case, you tried reading it and found it, for instance, I'm using one of Pete's choice adjectives from the book, too dudeish. So there's room for all of that, but either way, you're going to want to return to Pynchon. Some of you on this call might know Pete from his time, I think it was 2017, 2018, as a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study. Also with us is Kyla Schuller. She is Associate Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers. And in her work, she investigates the intersections between race, gender, sexuality, and the life sciences in US culture. And her forthcoming book, The Trouble with White Women, A Counter-History of Feminism, is a new look at the history of white feminism. And I hope that maybe we can have her back in the fall when that comes up. Kyla's previous book is The Biopolitics of Feeling, Race, Sex, and Science in the 19th Century. You're going to see a kind of 19th century through theme here. Gustavus Stadler, last but in no way least, also has a background in 19th century American literary and cultural studies. But in more recent years, he has turned to the study of sound, media, popular music, and is the author of Troubling Minds, The Cultural Politics of Genius in the US 1840 to 1890. Today, though, we are celebrating his new book, and it's just out, Woody Guthrie, An Intimate Life. I just want to show you briefly now what an embarrassment of riches in the book industry looks like. I don't remember a publisher squeezing quite as many, so here it is from the front, quite as many endorsements, really glowing endorsements, onto the cover of one book. You can see here. It's teeny tiny font. There are many of them. On the front, we have Grail Marcus. On the back, we have Billy Bragg, Ann Powers, many more. And I hope that Pete will hold up his book so you can see that when I bring him up on screen. I left my copy at the bookstore. So when we were preparing this event, I asked Peter if he could send a few lines that might provide a kind of frame for the conversation, which is occasioned, as I just said, by his own new book on Pynchon and by Gus's new book on Woody Guthrie. And the sentences he sent me included the question that you probably read when you registered for this event. And I'm going to just repeat it because it's very beautiful. What happens to broadly leftist coalitions, as well as to their imaginings of justice, care, art, struggle, comradeship, sex, love, and freedom itself in moments of historical fracture and collision? With that, what had maybe seemed a sort of maybe disparate and unwieldy combination was bridged and connected and given a strong pulse. So I urge you to read both Pete's and Gus's new books for a host of reasons. If I had to choose one for each, I would say for Pete's book, it's the way that Vineland Reread is both about and is itself an instance of language making or remaking life worlds. And those are worlds that are infused with warmth, laughter, tenderness, grief, and radical politics. For Gus's book, I'm going to just also pick one thing that for me stands out, and that's the profound surprise to me of the theme of shame and repair from shame as a theme around which to expand our notions of Guthrie's politics and hopefully also our own. So all of this is to say that I can't wait to hear from these two, and I'm thrilled that their friend and colleague Kyla can join them. I'm grateful to Kyla for agreeing to moderate, and she is also then going to pull up your questions and give you a chance to ask those. So as I bring them up, please, I'm going to channel all the applause that you would be, here they come, you would be giving, that we would be giving. Keep clapping there because I'm trying to bring them up. Okay, there's Peter Coviello. And here, trying again for Gus. Gus, you're stuck. Okay, Kyla, I'm going to bring you up first. Here's Kyla.
It looks like my camera's not on now.
Yeah, Gus, you're stuck. So Gus has not been lucky on this platform. You know what? Can I ask you to just leave and come back in?
Sure.
And, it'll be real quick.
Oh, there we are.
Oh, Gus, there you are.
No need for that. Awesome. It was just taking its time. Yeah. Welcome to all of you. So good to have you here. And I'm going to duck out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothea.
Thank you very much.
And welcome, everyone. We're delighted to see so many people here. And I'm especially excited for this pleasure of speaking with Coviello about his new book, Vineland Reread, and Gus's Woody Guthrie biography, An Intimate Life. We're framing this talk around the idea of left pasts and left futures, and how these pivotal figures and their cultural production offer really interesting revisionary and reparative reads of how we understand left collective building and making. And to start that, I'd like to ask each of you if you would read a short 4, 5, 6-minute segment of your book to give us a sense of the kind of texture and nuance you're bringing to this work, as well as the moment in left history that you're writing about. So Gus, I'll turn to you first.
So this is from my a couple of excerpts from my introduction. The familiar image of Woody Guthrie is of a rough and ready folk singer who scrawled militant slogans on his guitar, a champion of the common man, a master composer of the protest song, a boxcar hopping ramblin' man in the romantic tradition of peripatetic figures like Huckleberry Finn and Natty Bumppo, perhaps even a blueprint for the imminent emergence of Jack Kerouac and Neil Cassidy in their roles as countercultural heroes. We know him as a fierce supporter of the labor movement, a passionate cheerleader for the public works project of the New Deal, and perhaps some kind of communist. He's well established as Bob Dylan's idol and mentor. An anodyne version of the song, "This Land is Your Land," stripped of a verse indicting the concept of private property, circulates through elementary schools and various misbegotten political campaigns, making it easy for us to know him as a classic American mythical figure, the male wanderer, unfettered by social conventions associated with home, work, and family. It's a fantasy of rebellion so widely evoked for so long as to be paradoxically, quintessentially conventional. The magnetism of this Woody Guthrie has obscured another side of him, the side that is the focus of this book. Quote, "The lesson to learn, the only lesson to learn, is just when to be and when not to be very personal." He scrawled this during one of his frantic writing sessions in the mid-1940s as he was trying to continue expanding his artistic profile while witnessing the labor-centered left, amid which he'd earned his reputation, struggled to resist the cold wave of post-war anti-communist hysteria. He was someone interested in thinking about how it feels to be in the world, with what makes us feel good, being close to others, sharing secrets with them, having sex with them, and what makes us feel bad, injustice and inequality, but also shame, insult, isolation from loved ones. This Guthrie was an artist in multiple modes: music, verse and prose, fiction, painting, who didn't set the personal against the political. The personal wasn't synonymous with the private in the sense of that term, suggesting a retreat from the public world of politics and power struggle. The political stakes of knowing, quote, when to be very personal, reflected his deep concern with what our bodies tell us about life, with how they make us vulnerable to and dependent on others, with how they make the historical context in which we live not just an object of knowledge, but something we feel. He conveyed this perspective in the way he described his contact with the Communist Party in Oklahoma. Quote, "They gave me as good a feeling as I ever got from being around anybody in my life." He read Marx, but he was not a theorist or a policymaker, at least not in the traditional sense. A just reorganization of the world, he believed, would occur not at the behest of some intellectual's insight, but because the people who made up the mass had been empowered to resist the feelings of demoralization and cynicism forced on them. Capitalism and fascism both secured hegemony by maintaining particular emotional environments, encouraging cruelty and shame, and persuading people that they were, quote, born to lose. As with healing damaged bodies, overcoming this abject emotional atmosphere required interpersonal collaboration, acts of repair. Feeling shame was a kind of social wound that could be treated by love and reassurance. His role as an artist was essentially the role of a partner or other intimate, to solve these feelings and rejuvenate participation in the fight for justice. I'm just going to read one little other bit. In the expanded range of his work, we see a pre-1960s US left with which we are not familiar. We see in particular a great deal of very direct material about life as felt, in particular about the dispiriting power of shame and being stigmatized, and about the need for intimacy as a solve for shame. We also see a lot of writing about sex, not a topic that tends to come to mind when thinking of cultural war horses of the old left like John Steinbeck and Pete Seeger. Guthrie became known as a protest singer, but that label fails to capture the extent to which a general practice of living focused on concern for working and poor people's emotional well-being drove him as an artist. To him, this view did not contradict commitments to the labor movement or even communism. Indeed, he saw capitalism as an economic system that worked the life out of people's bodies and subsumed them in worry, shame, and guilt, all the while convincing them that they were at base faulty and inadequate. This poisonous process, in his understanding, infected both bodies and minds, making people physically, psychologically, existentially sick. His music addressed people feeling alienated, inferior, and out of sync with the way capitalist interests had choreographed the world in which they lived. There have been labor songs since the late 19th century. The IWW first published its Little Red Songbook in 1909, and it was full of rousing tributes to workers and their fallen martyrs. But there was something distinctly different about Guthrie's songwriting. It sought a kind of connection via what Guthrie would have called being personal. He did what the best writers of popular song do, establish an emotional connection with their audiences, making each listener believe the singer is singing about their life, their thoughts, feelings, and experiences in particular. Guthrie was an artist of an era in which, as cultural theorist Lauren Berlant puts it, quote, "The fundamental gift message of popular culture is, you are not alone." To those dragged down into shame and self-loathing by structural inequality, he was friend, lover, therapist, even mother. For Guthrie, intimacy was the place where people made one another powerful.
Thank you so much. That really beautiful framing. I don't know if you're hearing an echo. I'm hearing them on my end. Hopefully you're not on your end. That kind of compelling, nuanced framing drives your narrative throughout the book, and it's such a delight as a reader. Pete, if you would share from Vineland Reread.
I am. That is a hard act to follow. Gus is from the introduction, and I'm going to spoiler it by reading from the near end of the pension book. And it's a point where I'm talking about the disparate but related left critical traditions that might be described as humanist and anti-humanist, both of which take up Pynchon. And I say about these two different traditions of left scholarship around Pynchon, say local imperatives, specific subsets of analytic questions, and my own affinities may in a given instance offer a kind of priority to one or another of these inflections of the critical tradition, but I take that to matter at best incidentally, and I hope you can see why. For where we find ourselves conceptually is inevitably in relation to where we find ourselves, you could say, planetarily. Nothing about the current conjuncture, as the critical quarterlies say, seems to me liable to come into especially educative clarity in the terms of any single analytic idiom we might find lying near to hand. The rising tides of non-imaginary fascisms I mentioned earlier, the carceral nightmare, the planetary despoilment, the remaking of global polity on the model of liberal enfranchisement for the oligarchs, police state for all else, and so on, appears to me to mark out at the very least a moment of spectacular and spectacularly heterodox need. We might well disincline inside such a moment to relinquish any of our most vibrant and demanding critical traditions, whatever their fractious non-coincidence. Confronted with such fractiousness, the urgent matter, so far as my own battered political bearings can make out, might be to figure out how to make something usable and potent, something somehow nourishing out of their sustained irresolution. And this, I suppose, is a thing I have come to cherish about Pynchon, even here, and even in these dire late days, and even in sight of the many unevennesses of a book like Vineland, which, in any case, it seems like I will forever just stupidly love anyway. I am thinking of the heartening way the ambitions we might think of as most broadly humanist in Vineland, but not only there, hold space with such measured grace with the kinds of political critique in which it is no less forcefully invested, and with the kinds of refusal of humanism in its liberalized forms that follow from them. This is no mean trick, as most everything about our hard to conceptualize and rapidly collapsing present tense is always and everywhere reminding us, if Vineland is ongoingly wonderful to me, it is not only for its hilarity, and not only for its ludicrous inventiveness, and not only for the acuity of its vision of neoliberalism as the age of total and ceaseless carceral counterinsurgency. I love these things, absolutely. And I have tried to redescribe them in a way that might make them lovable to you too. But I am moved no less by Pynchon's symphonic orchestration of these disharmonious strains, his conjuring of a world where laughter and outrage each circulate within the orbital pull of the other to the diminishment of neither.
Thank you so much, Pete. Demonstrating your truly singular skill at writing beautiful 7-clause sentences with self-propulsion. that is a delight and an instructive delight as a reader of pushing the limits of joyous and critical language can look like. I wonder if you would both talk a little bit about how your figures and the cultural production you're writing about are situated within different moments of the left, and how Pynchon's Vineland and Guthrie's work over decades was articulating and part of the enmeshment of a larger political movement in its era. And then also, just if you would tell us a little bit about when and how you came to realize how you weren't just writing about these figures, but also writing a story about the left.
Should I start since I'm chronologically earlier? I was initially, the thing that got me into this project was this really random fact that I encountered while I picked up a Woody Guthrie biography, not really having been that interested in folk music or even Woody Guthrie, but sort of, you know, more in him actually, I guess. And I'm a scholar of the history of sexuality, and there was a strange moment that I'd never heard of where he had been arrested on obscenity charges for sending these erotic letters through the mail, and as a result, been sentenced to time in a sex deviance clinic. This is in the late 40s, and you know, I got interested in what this was about and what that place was about, and just this image of like an old left hero sitting in this place among a population of probably like 90% gay and queer people. And it reminded me of this image that in Ginsberg's Howl, where he writes about old left communists like in a prison cell all singing the Internationale. It kind of just conjured that, and it just made me it started just to make me think about that era of the old left's decline, and you know what it was like to live that, and what, you know, possible forms of like maintaining some kind of left world during that time could have existed. And you know, I think the other thing, so it became a story about the left like really, really quickly for me, even though at the same time I was really attracted just by the material in Guthrie's archive. I'm just so excited, and it's just so aesthetically rich and you know, huge and varied and everything. But I think, you know, I just especially became interested in how in a place like this, that clinic as like a sort of space of like as a sort of laboratory for shame in various ways. And Guthrie begins to really respond to that, to start thinking about shame as like a form of organizing while he's in not this first institutional state, but one soon after that. And I think that's where I began to wonder about sort of like the history of shame in relation to the US left, and the fact that it doesn't get talked about that much with the old left. And I went on from there to sort of to find a sort of different version of the old left, actually looking through this issue of shame.
Gus, that's awesome. My answer is a little, it's related, but it's a little different, which is that I was asked to be part of this series, which is a great series, and its premise is like 33 1/3, those books about records, but for novels. And I had always loved this novel and wanted to write about it. But of course I wrote the whole thing in 2019, which it's easy to forget because of the horribleness of 2020, was also exceedingly horrible. And a pitch of the book would that it would be a palimpsest of different moments of uptake. Like Vineland comes out in 1990, and it is itself a palimpsest. It comes out in 1990, takes place largely in the summer of 1984, is largely about political upheaval in 1968 and 69, though it harks back also to the days of the IWW and to the blacklists. And so what part of what it became a way for me to encounter more fully is not just like a question about, it's the book that you could say comes at the beginning of neoliberalism. And it offers a thick description of neoliberalism, but it also offered for me a description of like just how fully inside the horizon of liberal imaginings I was for many years when I encountered the book, and what it would take for the novel to grow into what I would now say it is, which is like a heart-stricken anti-fascist novel that is also about neoliberalism. And what it ends up saying about neoliberalism, it seems to me at least, is not just that it is like the thing that is involved with manic privatization and social democracy for the oligarchs and police states for everyone else, but that it also involves two things, like the police, like insane carceral counterinsurgency as mode of life, but also it seems to me to think of neoliberalism as a kind of historiography, a way of estranging us from our own pasts. Part of the point of the book is that, like, you know what's hard to remember in 1990? In 1990 is that from 1966 to 1970, there were a number of armed rebellions against the state. Like very well organized, very coordinated, and very devoted people from a variety of positions contesting the state's monopoly on violence. And it's easy to forget that in the sort of neoliberal reproduction of it as an era of counterculture of it. And that was really important to me. That as Gus was saying, like looking for a kind of left path that I just had become stupid about being able to see. And Pynchon, of all people, help me see a different version of that. So that would be my sort of answer of the interplay between like the rising fascism of 2019 and the novel from 1990.
Which I admit that I do already forget, like let alone 1990, but 2019 is a distant blur. Go through examples of how your works shake up our usual narrative about the left's moment of decline, and that we have these gaping, cavernous periods of absolute absence of the left, right? The left is present only in its utter negation. Guthrie, giving us this really fascinating account of Guthrie and his and being arrested for sexual deviance, which totally blows apart our usual trajectory of what old left concerns are from new left concerns, right? The overcoming of sexual shame we don't think of as part of a left social movement until the late 60s at the earliest. And Pete, you're similarly asking us to unthink our attachment to the idea that the left must always already be in decline, right? Even at its peak, it's always already falling over and about to be utterly vanquished in a backlash. So I wonder if you would elaborate more on how your figures ask us to revisit this idea of this inevitable, wounding, even tragic left decline over the 20th century into the present.
Well, one thing that it really interested me as a result of kind of starting with the sex deviance clinic as my way into this was, well, first of all, the discovery that Harry Hay, who some people may have heard of, who founded the first national gay rights group, the Mattachine Society, had been an old left communist in Los Angeles. He had lived in the same neighborhood that Guthrie lived in, and he had actually been lovers with Guthrie's best friend, Guthrie's best friend from the late 30s on, an actor named Will Geer, who you may know from the Waltons as Grandpa Walton. so there, it's not clear to me that any of that happened. I don't think any of that happened like outside of the closet. But there seemed to be like this kind of hidden history of sexual politics, at least, happening that was identifiable in that direction. And so, I don't even know if Guthrie and Geer ever talked about his queerness, or, I mean, how would we know necessarily? But I do think, I do sort of hypothesize that is one of a number of things that gave him this kind of attunement to shame and to and stigma, and what the capacity for sort of forming relationships through that. And that does actually pan out, as if you see in one of the later times he was in a mental hospital. He has this interesting conversation with a gay man and says that he calls him sick in his own healthy way, which is a kind of neat phrase. But he kind of talks through some of these issues with him. A different kind of way that I think the project really impacted and changed my sense of this historiography, actually surprisingly had to do with Black radicalism. And because Guthrie was he didn't have a Communist Member Party card or whatever, whatever, that thing that they use as an excuse for, but he was a communist. And he was around communists constantly. And he was in the late 40s and early 50s around a lot of Black communists and a lot of people involved in this group called the Civil Rights Congress. And so, paying attention to that, the history of that movement has been really obscured by the historiography that teaches the beginning of the civil rights movement is Rosa Parks, this little old lady, gets on the bus and she's tired and she won't give up her seat. And now we know she was an activist and all these things, but there's, even before that, there's all of this kind of radical, very active struggle going on, very either in or adjacent to the Communist Party, about things like police violence, about in the North, about housing segregation in the North, all kinds of things that aren't just kind of access to public services. And Guthrie's really reading about this stuff happening, and he's writing songs based on this document that the Civil Rights Congress writes called "We Charge Genocide." That they addressed to the United Nations, arguing that basically that police violence is modern day lynching. And so, I thought it was remarkable. His interest in that was remarkable, but also just that broader history of Black radicalism, which, I'm sure people who have studied more of that and, have been reading Robin Kelley all these years and all that stuff are more familiar with. But to me, it really brought that home. And then, the idea that somebody like Guthrie could get caught up in that was fascinating.
Yeah, very relatedly, for me, is again a historiographic question. Kyla, I liked your sense too that Vineland is a comedy in a lot of ways. It's a comedy about a moment of political abjection. It's a comedy about 1984. And that, I like how you say it, is a kind of refusal of the sense of the left is already defeated. And what the novel tries to do, of course, is think of, a couple things at once, that tries to say that capitalism and fascism are quite compatible with one another, and that's sort of Gravity's Rainbow extended, and that there's a great tradition of sort of labor anti-fascism that had never been killed off, and that flourished early in the century, and that flourished in mid-century, and that flourished again in the 60s, and that required a tremendous labor of counterinsurgent action to suppress. And there's a sort of knock on the novel that's a kind of sentimental. It's about families coming back together. It's about generations, and like whatever's fair. That's not an unfair reading of the novel, but it seems to me Pynchon's interested in exactly what you described, sort of like the durability of left socialities and solidarities, even in and through moments of like complete abjection, moments in which they're like literally being assassinated, literally being imprisoned. And it endures in various pockets. Part of the reason the novel is as in love with Northern California as it is that it thinks of Northern California as a place where the embers of that unextinguished left fire still exist and are still accessible, despite what you might see in the newspapers or especially on cop-saturated television. So those are the ways that it seems to me to go together nicely.
Cop-saturated television, along with manic privatization, are as good a description as any I've heard. Just like sick in his own healthy way is as spectacular a synonym for queer as I've ever heard. One of the things
that's awesome.
About both your works is how you overturn the myth of the heroic singular white man of the left. By looking at not just any figure, but perhaps two of the iconic figures who are elicited, right, conscripted into that narrative. Even as someone like Guthrie is so obviously also about building collective social movements. But I really like how you emphasize not just the seemingly political, even masculinized world of solidarity building, but that everyday domestic texture of friendship, alliance, camaraderie, even a word that Gus uses over and over again, intimacy, as what the texture of the left looks like. And as a feminist scholar, it makes me even think that this is a way of recovering a kind of feminine energy that I would argue that feminists historically have been some of the most aggressive at shunting out of social politics, right? So much of the history of white feminism, anyway, is a history to strip femininity and to accept its conscription as passivity and to adopt a androgynous, i.e. masculine mode. You give us, if anything, intimate, vulnerable, maybe even feminized version of your figures. And so I wonder if you would say a little more about why you think it's been so hard to see that this domestic, intimate texture actually undergirds left movement building, and two, how your figures help snap that into focus for you. And maybe let's start with Pete. Mix things up.
Dude, that's such a great question, in part because, I mean, the truthful answer to that is Pynchon sees that and produces aspects of antidote to that. And those are exactly, as you say, about like the intimate and domestic textures of sociality. And like Zoid with the baby, for years we have a revolutionary mother and a single dad with his daughter. But it's also true that Pynchon doesn't see that quite as clearly as one might wish. And he is absolutely not like himself steeled against the heroicization of a certain kind of masculine heroism in revolutionary politics, and his toggling between them, while sometimes energizing, is also just that, like a toggling that can't quite make sense of himself. It's not an unfair knock on Pynchon, who, again, I have a lot of affection for, to say, like, he is smart enough and funny enough to see the limitations of like the new left man. But his books don't quite get to the outside of it. And if they did, and this is, I think, what talking with you has really helped me see better, if they were to, it would be through the vein of the sort of the worlds of like intimate sodalities that he's always imagining. Those like textured, intimate scenes that are often giving way to like larger and larger claims. So I think Gus may have the more edifying answer to this question, though.
I mean, I think it's a different, set of texts, but I think Well, one thing that I think that Guthrie, or my study of Guthrie, revealed is just, obviously there's a lot of homosociality on the left, and there's a lot of homosociality in that kind of like legendary world of men in boxcars and that sort of thing. But there really is a kind of, or he portrays that world as really an environment of care and repair. And like his favorite song of all time was a song called Hobo's Lullaby, which a lot of people think he wrote. It was written by a man named Goebbels Reeves, but it's like, go to sleep, my little darling, as the rails go slowly by. We're in a nice warm boxcar. It's the whole, this is the Hobo's Lullaby. There's like a line about the police can't bother you here, and it's just this beautiful lullaby, like a man singing a lullaby to another, like a homeless man singing a lullaby to another homeless man. And like with Guthrie in particular, there are all these moments of kind of quasi-mothering, like he both represents in, say, this, that there's a in his autobiography Bound for Glory, he I don't know if he has a song being sung, but he in the first chapter he's in this packed box car, and he keeps like there's one young guy that these guys are all making fun of because like he's hugging a pillow and kissing it, and he like shoos them away, he shoos the crowd away, who are like teasing him, again, this sort of interest in and attunement to shame, like being the thing. And then he like devises this way so that the oldest people in the car can like spend more time at the door where there's more air. And like this sort of use of like a maternal approach to repair, I think going back to this traumatic aspect of his childhood, which involved his mother having Huntington's disease, the chronic, the terminal disease that he would have later, and him watching his mother decline, and at some points having to really mother his mother. So there's a kind of personal dimension in his history that I think gives him this sort of drive to take up that motherly position, or fill it for other people, or since he can't have it for himself. That happens later too, when he gets married and he has a kid, and he becomes the house, the homemaker. His wife is a dancer, Martha Graham dancer, and she's out dancing and then later teaching dance. So and all of this stuff, I think it's not. It's wrapped in. It's very much wrapped in with his sense of being a leftist and a communist. And there's I found a lot of articles posted about like the Soviet family in like the New Masses and Daily Worker and stuff, which seemed to be, that was really like the most radical sort of models of domesticity. They didn't seem to draw very much on like American examples or things that were actually happening to party members or something like that. But like there was a lot of, that their interest in like social organization in the Soviet Union very much included this interest in family life and its configuration.
Yeah. Gus, that makes me want to, like, I think that helps me think of a better answer to Kyla's question, which is that one thing I can say about the novel that I will say strongly on its behalf, it's like a lot of knock against Pynchon, as some of you probably know, is like he's very cold and he has a very sort of artificial sense of character. But that's not my experience of Vineland at all. And when you were talking about like nurturing, one of the things I try to write about in the book is the like tremendous tenderness of regard for the fictional characters who populate Northern California in this collapsing moment, and just for the fucking ways they struggle. Like the quotidian ways they struggle and struggle collectively. And that like the good-humored, open-hearted tenderness with which he regards that is in Vineland very striking and does not accord in any way with the like cold, cerebral, postmodern, whatever. And that I think the way you just described Guthrie's sort of nurturance makes that more articulable to me.
It's sort of, well, I don't know. If anybody's seen Nomadland, I think there's some of that quality to the acts of kindness in that film, where it's like kind of portrayed as genuine kindness. People, these itinerant people are treating each other with, but also it's just like this kind of collectivist act of survival. It's both, it's sweet and it's like fucking necessary.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting representative of that, and it reminded me of some of the stuff I encountered with this.
Yeah.
A reminder, we'll have open Q&A in a minute. I want to ask one final question quickly before moving to open Q&A. So if you would put your question in the ask a question link at the bottom of the screen. But first, this makes me want to ask more about the role of feeling in your works and the figures you're writing about. Pete, you write, the dire and the ludicrous refuse to become disentangled in Pynchon's work in Vineland. And you both show how there's these varied non-binary emotions, and you really dig into the richness of the emotional and affective life of these, who some might call, bro figures of 20th century politics. And I wonder if you would explain a little bit about why you think that emotion is nonetheless so important to structural politics. Like, how do your figures' analyses of life-annihilating systems nonetheless only function through becoming intertwined with capacities for deep, even seemingly contradictory feeling? How can we use these figures to get past the idea that there's a structural politics and then there's a politics of individual psychic feeling here?
Well, one way I think this happens for Guthrie is, again, going back to this interest in shame, attunement to shame, like, very much biographically earned, all the way going back to his childhood. The sort of extent to which he didn't just repress it, neither did he just kind of commit himself to like a politics of pride, in that binary, that sort of shame pride binary. Like, he was too interested in it. He was either too interested in it or too, he felt too connected to a collectivity of shamed people to just be like, okay, I feel good about myself, like, let me show you how to feel good about myself, about yourself, or whatever, something of that mode. And so, like, yeah, and so to that extent, kind of rejecting that premium that sort of politics of pride can put on individualism, but also I think, I talked later in the book about his kind of late confrontation with some really horrible racial violence that happened in his hometown in his past, and like, I think, and that he was really not able to deal with in any serious way for a long time. His father was involved in a lynching, is basically what happened. It's right before he was born. And I think, in that case, that felt to me like a place where shame gave him like a sort of like a something like a critical view of whiteness. Like, he was able to see his way of like bringing that shame, finally, about that incident and his family's linked to it, was to make all these paintings about whiteness. They're really, really interesting and really crazy looking, but of people being lynched, and the word white like scrawled all over them, and so I feel like that was another kind of instance of this, apparently internal feeling exfoliating out into this kind of like, actually this conception that there is this entity called whiteness. It's not just like a bunch of white racist people, but there's something bigger than that happening. And to me, that was the greatest achievement of his late career, are those paintings and like the ideas behind them.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I guess what you say about like not making a binary of shame with pride is so awesome. It's just so like exacting. I'll just like very, very quickly, one way of thinking about Vineland, the first novel that he writes after like the huge event that is Gravity's Rainbow, and it's like 17 years later. And it disappoints a lot of people because it's antic and it's largely comic and silly, and it involves this sort of like family friendship. And it strikes me as not surprising that he was writing it at the same time that he was writing Mason and Dixon, another book about empire, enslavement, and friendship. And there's just a part of Pynchon that is really committed to friendship, not as like the horizon of politics, not as the thing that all politics depends on, but something that's so inside any kind of mechanisms of solidarity, any kinds of mechanisms of like political sodality, that he wants to think hard about. And he wants to think also very, very hard about how the intimacies of solidarity can be captured or can be poisoned or can be repurposed or anything like that. But like the intimate sphere of solidarity is it's a scene of tremendous importance to his anti-fascist imagination. That's what I would say.
Excellent. There are great questions coming in the chat. I'll pose one for each of you together at once. So first for Gus, what is it about Guthrie's exploration of a politics of shame that could be used by the left today? And how might that be used? And or are there movements on the left that you see as already engaged in that work? And for Pete, do you see collective experiments today on the left that are living socialities and solidarities of care?
Well, I mean, as somebody who came up, into queer studies in the 80s and 90s, and the sort of background for this whole, for my own interest in this is ACT UP and AIDS activism and the way that shame worked as a binding force there, but also as like a mode of aggressive critique and shaming people. Now that's 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. But I guess what I did appreciate about that and do still is that again, that hesitancy to just turn shame into pride, like, to sort of deny the texture and the details and, of what it's like to live with shame. And again, like the way that can function, that can operate to like bring you to other people. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the contemporary left, it's hard. I feel like I may be forgetting something. The thing I see in the contemporary left is a lot is, kind of return to identity politics, sort of as a form of pride. I don't think identity politics has to be that. It wasn't when it was first formulated as a term. I don't know. Do you have it? Do you guys have any?
Yeah, I would say like about the my answer to that would be like, there's like, if you want to feel immediately, if you want to just like hate liberals, just watch them talk about young people. Just watch them talk about young people. Like watch them condescend to young people and their ways of imagining precisely nurturing for one another and caring for one another. Oh, it's snowflake, it's whatever. Like, listen, do young people sometimes speak critical languages that sound a little too much like administrators and securitizing? Of course they do. They're young people, but they also produce amazing socialities of mutual care. I'm in Chicago, like BYP, Black Youth Project. That's just like one example of the proliferating kinds of like socialities, political socialities built around nurturance and care. And like, again, if you truly want to hate bourgeois liberals, just watch their detestation and their condescension toward young people, and oh, they're obsessed with safety and security. And that's just like, first of all, bullshit. It's a falsification. And second of all, like, refuses to see what might be precisely what Gus and Kyla have described, like politics of nurturance and care and intimate life producing larger claims on structures. Not as isomorphic to one another, but as like, you know, dialectically important to the unfolding of social movements.
That's really helpful.
To be able to answer a question with hate, I feel like.
Or even the various mutual aid practices in the pandemic, you know, and how they've been taken up by the left quite explicitly by people like AOC, by turning to Black feminists who have been developing this practice for decades, like Mariam Kaba and others. Or even I'm reminded of how the parts of the country that have had the best success at distributing the vaccine are indigenous reservations in the Midwest, right? And like that wouldn't necessarily fall into our usual categorization of what a left solidarity looks like. And yet, if our left solidarity definition is a counter-state practice that contests the violence of the US nation state and that offers a generational and ethical community in response, then the indigenous reservations of the northern Midwest absolutely fit that bill. This is maybe a related question coming in from the chat for both of you, which is, why do you think there are no musical voices for the left today? No Woody, Pete, or Joan Baez, only Springsteen singing for a Jeep commercial.
Well, I think that there are voices for, I guess it's, you know, this is where we get into, are we talking about the left? Are we talking about, you know, how coherent? I think with those figures you name, like you kind of, when you use the category of the left, you kind of know who you're talking about. And it's kind of like a largely white group of people, like kind of maybe working class and middle class. My sense is that like music with political impact and value now is not protest music in the same way that the figures that you named would write it, with very direct forms of, you know, slogans and or mentioning specific strikes or whatever, but it can be something more like creating an atmosphere. I'm thinking about Kendrick Lamar's.
Gus, you stole my answer.
Oh, sorry. You want to take over?
No.
Kendrick Lamar's "We're Gonna Be All Right." You know, like that was in the first Black Lives Matter wave. People were just chanting, "We're gonna be all right. We're gonna be all right." And it's just like it really like creates this atmosphere. It's kind of empowering atmosphere, this kind of safe atmosphere. I think some of the material in that D'Angelo album too that came out around then, like a kind of obliquely made reference to violence against young Black men, but it wasn't the center of the song. So like it seems like some of these artists are trying to build worlds. They're trying to acknowledge an issue, but they're also trying to like build a world around that acknowledgement. So like there's something alive there, there's space there, and the song isn't absolutely consumed by like some just very direct expression of whatever the issue to be protested is. I don't know. That's my take on it.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Sorry. Well, there's still people like, you know, the Rage Against the Machine guy, and Billy Bragg, but
yeah, another, like, the Kendrick Lamar seems like the very popular version. Another way to say it, a far, like, not exclusively but very white answer is like, oh, there were like DIY punks in the 80s, and then in the 90s it became kind of indie rock, which was much more collegiate and bougie. But there are also elements of like DIY lefty Fugazi-ish acts that are still alive, like Parquet Courts or whatever does not exist without that world and its ongoingness. So I would concur with Gus that there's a lot of like politically vibrant music.
Hi.
Awesome. This has been so fun to listen into, and Kyla, I've loved the prompts for thought that you've provided for everyone. It's just been wonderful. I would love to see the two of you, Gus and Pete. I know Pete is the master of the mixtape. I would love to see you guys co-curate a playlist on Spotify in answer to that last question. That would be amazing to see. So yeah, what a rich conversation. I really want to thank all of you, and want to just quickly maybe let everyone on this call now know about an event that's coming up on our on this platform that I'm super excited about and that this group might be interested in. We have Daphne Brooks talking about her new book, which is called Liner Notes for the Revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound. It's an incredible, incredible book. I've just started reading it. She is an extraordinary musicologist, but much more than that. And she will be talking with Tracy Smith, the poet Tracy Smith, on April 1st. So look out for that. Join us again for that, or for anything in between. And in the meantime, I wish everyone a really good evening tonight. Pour yourselves a glass of wine. I wish I could be doing that with you, for you. And I look forward to shared space again when we can all do that. But in the meantime, abundant thanks to you guys. And
Dorothy, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure, really. And there they are, these great books.
More. We only skim the surface of these fascinating, gorgeous books.
Yeah. And Kyla, I really would love to do something for your book when it comes out. So we'll talk about that.
I'd love to, yeah.
Okay. You all take care and be well. Bye-bye.